The city never truly sleeps. It only learns to breathe differently when darkness falls. On this particular October night, New York was angry. Thunder cracked between the steel giants of Manhattan like the earth itself was breaking. Rain fell in sheets, violent and merciless, turning the streets into rivers of despair and broken dreams. Under the awning of Romano's trattoria, on a quiet corner of the Upper West Side, a small figure curled into itself like a question mark seeking an answer that would never come. Her name was Eva Moretti, though the world had long since stopped calling her anything at all. She was 32 years old, but looked older, the kind of older that comes not from time, but from loss. 3 months ago, Eva had a job. 3 months ago, she had an apartment in Queens, with photographs on the walls and a plant by the window that she watered every Sunday. 3 months ago, she had a sister who called her at night to complain about her boyfriend, and a mother who made Sunday dinners that filled the whole house with warmth and possibility. Then came the cancer diagnosis. Then came the debt. Then came the choices that weren't really choices at all. Her sister stopped returning her calls after Eva borrowed money she couldn't repay. Her job ended when she missed too many days at the hospital. Her apartment became impossible when the eviction notice appeared like a curse. And her mother left the world on a Tuesday in September, leaving Eva with nothing but memories and a grief so heavy it could drown her where she stood. So she ran. Or rather, she simply stopped running and allowed herself to be broken into pieces small enough to slip through the cracks of the city. That night, as lightning illuminated the rain-soaked streets in stuttering white flashes, Eva huddled under the restaurant's awning. Her clothes clung to her skin like a second body made of ice. Her hair, once carefully styled for job interviews she no longer attended, hung in wet strands against her face. She had $17 in her pocket and nowhere to go tomorrow morning. She had everything to lose and nothing left to hold on to. She closed her eyes and simply waited for the night to end. She didn't pray anymore. Prayer had become a luxury for people who still believed the world made sense. Instead, she thought about her mother's hands, weathered from decades of cooking, and how those hands would never touch her face again. She thought about the warmth of that impossible apartment in Queens. She thought about a version of herself that belonged to someone, that mattered to someone, that was more than just a shadow huddled in the rain. Her breath became shallow. Her shivering eventually stopped, which she understood somewhere in the rational part of her mind that still functioned was not a good sign. It meant her body was giving up, surrendering to the cold. In a strange way, this felt like mercy. The exhaustion was so complete that she welcomed it like an old friend finally arriving with good news. That was when the night changed forever. The rain was still falling when Luca Romano's car pulled up to the restaurant just after 5 in the morning. This was his ritual, arriving before the city woke up, before his men arrived, before the weight of running an empire could settle on his shoulders again. These early hours belonged only to him, or so he had convinced himself over the years. Luca was 54 years old and looked it in ways that had nothing to do with the grey threading through his dark hair or the lines around his eyes. Those lines were from smiling, from genuine moments of joy, moments that had become increasingly rare since his wife Isabel died 12 years ago. Most of the other lines were from something else entirely: responsibility, violence, choices made in darkness that echoed through the daylight hours. He had been born in this city, the son of immigrants who worked in restaurants and dreamed of something better for their children. His father had built Romano's trattoria from nothing, and Luca had watched him do it with a combination of pride and resentment that only a child could manage. But when his father suffered a heart attack on the kitchen floor in 1998, everything changed. Luca was 28 years old. He was supposed to take over the restaurant. Instead, he took over a different kind of operation, the kind that existed in shadows and whispered conversations, the kind that made men fear his name. He had been good at it. Too good, perhaps. He had built something powerful, something vast, something that consumed every waking hour, and most of his sleeping ones, too. He had money now, more money than anyone needed. He had respect, or what passed for respect in the world where he operated. Respect born from fear, which was never the same thing, though most people couldn't tell the difference. But he had lost his wife. He had lost his children to their own lives, to their own distance, to the unspoken knowledge that their father was not a good man, even if he loved them deeply. And he had kept the restaurant, Romano's Trattoria, as a kind of memorial to his father, and as a cover, and as a reminder that there had once been a version of himself that made things rather than destroyed them. Luca parked his car in the alley and stepped out into the rain. He didn't use an umbrella. He had learned long ago that some things were inevitable, and you could either accept them or waste energy resisting. The rain soaked through his designer coat as he walked toward the restaurant's back entrance. That was when he saw her. At first, in the darkness and the rain, she was just a shape, a disturbance in the landscape, a shadow that didn't belong. But as he drew closer, she became unmistakably human. She was small, curled up like she was trying to make herself disappear, huddled against the cold concrete wall. Her clothes were soaked, her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality. And she was absolutely still, so still that for a moment Luca wondered if he was looking at something dead rather than alive. He stood there in the rain, this powerful man who had ordered people killed, who had no patience for weakness, who prided himself on being unmoved by sentiment or emotion. And something inside him cracked, like ice breaking on a frozen river, like a dam that had been holding back 12 years of grief finally giving way. He didn't call his men. He didn't question her. He didn't even particularly think through what he was doing. He simply bent down, his knees protesting the movement, a reminder that his body was aging even as his power seemed ageless, and he lifted her into his arms. She was impossibly light. He realized this meant she was starving. She was starving, and she was cold, and she had been abandoned, and the world had proven once again that it was indifferent to human suffering. Luca carried her inside. His hands, which had done terrible things, held her gently. His arms, which had pushed people down and held them there, cradled her like she was something precious. He laid her on one of the leather booth seats by the front window and stood there, dripping rain onto the polished floor, wondering what in the name of God he was supposed to do with this broken stranger. He covered her with his coat. He turned up the heat. He called Dr. Ferraro, the physician who asked no questions and who kept confidences like a priest keeps confessions. And he waited, watching her breathe, that shallow, uncertain breathing that spoke of a body pushed to its absolute limits, and he waited for her to wake up. Eva woke up in stages, like surfacing from an ocean trench. First came consciousness itself, the awareness that she existed, that she was somewhere, that her body was still performing the basic functions of a living thing. Then came sensation, warmth, which seemed miraculous after hours of cold, softness beneath her, the distant sound of voices, the smell of herbs and garlic and something else, old wood perhaps, or aged leather, or the accumulated history of thousands of meals. She opened her eyes to a ceiling she didn't recognize. It was pressed tin, ornate and old-fashioned, the kind of ceiling that spoke of another era, a time before the world had become so aggressively modern and disposable. She turned her head slowly, not trusting her body to cooperate, and found herself in what appeared to be a restaurant. She was lying in a booth. Above her hung old photographs, family pictures, it seemed, showing the progression of decades. A young man with dark eyes smiling at the camera, holding a whisk. A woman in a wedding dress. Children. Growth. Time passing in frozen moments. It was the kind of restaurant that felt like it had meaning, like it held stories in its very walls. Eva tried to sit up and discovered that her body had become a stranger to her. Everything hurt. Every muscle protested. Her throat felt like she had swallowed sandpaper. Her mind was foggy, operating at a distance from her own thoughts, as though she were trying to think through thick glass. That was when she noticed the man. He was sitting at a table across from her, reading a newspaper. He was older, with silver threading through dark hair, wearing an expensive suit that somehow looked both impeccably tailored and slightly lived in. There was something in the way he held himself, an absolute stillness, a kind of coiled power that made Eva's instincts scream that this was not an ordinary man. He sensed her waking. She saw him do it before he actually looked up, a slight tension in his shoulders, a shift in his breathing. When he turned to face her, his eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they held a depth that spoke of things Eva couldn't begin to understand. He said nothing. He simply looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood up and disappeared into the kitchen. Eva's heart was racing. She had no memory of how she got here. The last thing she remembered was the rain, the cold, the creeping numbness of her own body giving up. Then nothing. Nothing until this moment, in this strange restaurant with photographs on the walls and a man who looked at her like he could see all the broken pieces of her life. He returned carrying a bowl of soup. The smell of it made Eva's stomach clench with a hunger so profound it was almost painful. He set the bowl down on the table in front of her, along with a spoon and a glass of water. He didn't speak. He simply waited and watched and gave her space to choose. There was something extraordinarily kind about this, though Eva didn't have the emotional energy to question why a man like this, because he was definitely a certain kind of man, the kind that carried power like other people carried air, would show her kindness. She ate the soup slowly, her body remembering how to do this basic human function. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was warm broth with vegetables and small pieces of chicken, and with each spoonful, Eva felt something in her begin to repair itself. Not heal, healing would take longer than she probably had, but repair, stabilize, begin to remember what it meant to be alive rather than merely existing. The man watched her eat. He didn't interrupt, he didn't ask questions. He simply existed in the space with her, patient and silent, like he understood that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was the luxury of not having to explain themselves. When she finished, Eva set the spoon down. Her hands were still shaking. She looked at the man and tried to form words, but nothing came. What could she possibly say? Thank you seemed inadequate. Who are you? Seemed dangerous. Why did you save me? Seemed like a question whose answer she wasn't ready to hear. The man stood up. He gestured toward a door in the back of the restaurant. Eva understood that she was being invited to leave the dining room, to move to some other space. She didn't want to go, she was terrified of going. But she was also terrified of staying, and fear seemed to be the primary emotion guiding her decisions now. She stood up, slowly, carefully, like she was made of glass, and followed him. He led her to a small apartment above the restaurant. There was a living room with old furniture that had been expensive once, a kitchen barely used, and a bedroom with a bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. He pointed to the bed. He pointed to a bathroom door. He made a gesture that clearly meant she should make herself comfortable, that she should rest. Then he left her alone. Eva stood in the silence of this strange apartment and tried to understand what was happening. She had spent 3 months on the streets of New York City, and the fundamental lesson she had learned was simple. No one helped anyone without an agenda. Kindness was a currency that got you killed. Mercy was a trap. Men who rescued women wanted something in return. Sex or labor or someone to control or simple entertainment at the expense of another person's humiliation. But something in the way this man had looked at her suggested that he already had access to whatever he wanted. The way he carried himself, the casual authority that seemed to radiate from him. These things suggested that his desires, whatever they were, would not be interrupted by the presence of a broken woman in his restaurant. So, Eva showered. She stood under hot water for the first time in 3 months, and cried silently, letting the water mix with her tears, washing away the grime and pain and desperation that had accumulated on her skin. She put on clean clothes that he had left for her. Simple things, jeans and a sweater, basic and comfortable. And then she climbed into the bed and fell asleep in seconds, sinking into a darkness that was peaceful rather than terrifying. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to learn the truth about the man who had saved her. She didn't know that this act of compassion would become the most complicated thing that had ever happened to her. She didn't know that her life, which had seemed to end under that restaurant awning, was actually just beginning. Eva woke up in the early afternoon to the sound of sirens in the distance. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the details came back: the apartment, the man, the soup, the feeling of safety that she had almost forgotten existed. She lay in the bed and listened to the city. It sounded normal. It sounded like any other day in New York. But nothing about her life was normal anymore. Everything had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed, and she had no idea what lay on the other side of it. Eventually, she got out of bed. She found the apartment lived in more than she had realized at first. There were books everywhere: philosophy, psychology, novels in English and Italian. There were photographs on the shelves. The same man, younger, with a woman who was clearly his wife. They were laughing in the photo, genuinely laughing, and there was such love in their eyes that Eva had to look away. She recognized that kind of love. She had seen it in her own parents. It was the kind that broke you into pieces when it was gone. She made her way downstairs to the restaurant. It was early afternoon, hours before dinner service would begin. The restaurant was empty except for the man, who was sitting at the same table as before, reading a book in Italian. He looked up when he heard her come down the stairs. His expression didn't change much. This seemed to be a man who had learned to control his face over decades, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or relief. He gestured to the booth across from him. Eva sat down. The distance between them felt significant, like there was a physical manifestation of all the things they hadn't said to each other yet. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and careful. He told her his name was Luca. He told her the restaurant had belonged to his father. He told her she had been unconscious for 17 hours. He told her that Dr. Ferraro, the man who had come to check on her while she slept, said she was severely malnourished and dehydrated, but that she would recover with rest and food. What he didn't tell her was his last name. What he didn't tell her was what he really was, what his real business was, where his money came from. What he didn't tell her was that he was a man who had committed violence, who had caused pain, who had made choices that couldn't be unmade. But Eva already knew some of this. She recognized the type of man he was, the way authority sat on him like a second skin, the way people would jump if he asked them to, the way his power existed in the spaces between his words. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she asked him if she could work. She told him she could clean, she could cook if he needed her to, she could do anything. She told him she understood that nothing in the world was free, that there was always a price, and she wanted to know what his was. Luca listened to all of this. He watched her as she spoke, and his dark eyes held something complicated. Sadness, perhaps, or recognition. He told her that the only price was that she promised to take care of herself, that she promised to stay until she was fully recovered, that she promised to stop disappearing. It was a strange price. It was almost too generous to be believable. But Eva, who had nothing left to lose, agreed to it. The next 3 months unfolded in a way that Eva would have said was impossible if she hadn't been living through it herself. She worked in the restaurant, not as charity, but as a real job. She learned the menu, the rhythm of service, the way Luca's team operated. She recovered her strength slowly, cell by cell, meal by meal. The hollow spaces inside her began to fill up with something other than despair, and she learned things about Luca. She learned that he spent an hour every morning reading in the office before the restaurant opened. She learned that he was unfailingly kind to the elderly customers who came in regularly. She learned that he donated significant money to shelters, food banks, organizations that helped people who were in the situation she had been in. She learned that despite everything he was, despite all the terrible things she gradually understood he had done, he was trying to be good in the ways that were available to him. She also learned that he was terribly lonely. It became clear to her over time that this was the real reason he had brought her inside out of the rain. Not because he wanted something from her, but because he couldn't bear to see her suffer alone. Because somewhere deep inside him, grief had carved out a space where compassion could live. Because he understood what it meant to be broken and to keep going anyway. One evening, about 4 months after that night in the rain, Ava was closing the restaurant. It was late, nearly midnight, and the streets outside were quiet. She was counting the register when she heard the sound of breaking glass from the street outside. She ran to the window and saw 3 men, young, angry, clearly intoxicated, smashing the window of the restaurant across the street. They were shouting about something she couldn't hear clearly, but their rage was unmistakable. She stood frozen for a moment, then reached for her phone to call 911. She heard the restaurant door open. She heard Lucas' footsteps. She watched through the front window as he walked toward the men with absolute calm, as if he was simply going to ask them directions. She didn't see him do anything violent. She saw him talk to them. She couldn't hear the words, but his body language was clear. He told them something. He showed them something on his phone. And then, within minutes, the men were apologizing profusely and leaving the area, driving away into the night. Luca came back inside. He looked at Ava and seemed to understand that she had witnessed something, that she had seen a glimpse of who he really was. He looked tired suddenly, like the weight of his own existence had become too heavy to bear. He told her then, that night in the empty restaurant, that his wife had been hit by a car in front of a coffee shop, that a drunk driver had destroyed her body in seconds, that he had spent 12 years wondering if it could have been prevented, that he had spent 12 years thinking about how fragile life was, how easily it could end, how cruelly the world could take away the people you loved. He told her that when he saw her under the restaurant awning, he saw that same fragility. He saw a life that was slipping away, and for the first time since his wife died, he had felt like he could do something to prevent that loss. Ava listened to all of this. She understood finally what he was. She understood that he was a man capable of violence who had chosen, in at least one moment, to choose mercy instead. She understood that his salvation wasn't about redemption. Some people's sins run too deep for redemption. But it was about the possibility of being better, of making different choices, of using the power you have accumulated to help rather than hurt. She also understood that she loved him. Not in the romantic sense, though perhaps that would come later, or perhaps it would never come, and that would be fine too. But she loved him in the way you love someone who has saved your life, who has asked nothing from you except that you keep living, who has shared their grief with you in the darkness. The next morning, Ava woke up in the apartment above the restaurant. She lay in bed and thought about how different her life was from just a few months ago. She had a job. She had a home. She had a community, Luca's employees, the regular customers, the people who worked in the restaurant day after day. Most importantly, she had learned something that she thought she had lost forever. She had learned that the world could still surprise you, that there were people in the darkness who chose to light a candle rather than curse the night. That sometimes the most powerful acts weren't acts of violence at all, but acts of simple human kindness. She got out of bed and got dressed and went downstairs to open the restaurant. Luca was already there, as he always was, reading a book in Italian. He looked up when she came in and smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes, the kind that said he was glad she was there. Outside, the sun was shining. The rain from that terrible October night seemed like something from another lifetime. But Ava knew she would never forget it. She would never forget the coldness, the fear, the moment when she thought the world had finally decided to be done with her. And then a man appeared in the rain, a man who was all powerful and shadow, all darkness and contradiction. A man who lifted her up and carried her inside and said, without speaking, that her life still mattered. That was the real magic of it, she understood now. Not the miracle of survival, though that was part of it, but the miracle of being seen, the miracle of being chosen, the miracle of being told, in the darkest moment of your life, that you were worth saving. Ava learned that redemption isn't always about forgiveness. Sometimes it's about two broken people finding each other in the darkness and deciding to heal together. What did you think of Ava and Luca's story? Did you expect that ending? What would you have done if you had been in their positions? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us your theories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that the world still contains unexpected kindness. And please, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. We upload new narratives every week, stories about real people, real struggles, and the moments that change everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing in the power of human connection. We'll see you next time.